Have you ever really stopped to think about the sheer, just mind-boggling power you hold in your hands every single day?
Oh, it's wild when you actually pause and consider it.
Right. Like you are probably listening to this deep dive right now on a piece of glass and metal that can access the entirety of human knowledge in a fraction of a second.
Exactly. It's basically magic.
Yeah, and as a species, we have, split the atom. We are actively editing the human genome. We've got probes sailing through the freezing void way beyond the edge of our solar system.
It's an incredible resume for humanity.
It really is. But, and here's the kicker, if somebody abruptly cuts you off in traffic on your way home today, what is your immediate visceral reaction?
Oh, pure rage. Definitely.
Exactly. It is almost certainly a sudden surge of pure, unadulterated prehistoric rage.
Hmm.
You process that modern inconvenience using the exact same emotional hardware that our ancestors used while fighting off a rival tribe over a mammoth carcass.
That contrast is honestly terrifying when you put it like that.
It is. We are essentially toddlers holding state-of-the-art rocket launchers.
Hmm.
We have the emotional regulation of a 2-year-old prone to tantrums and impulsivity, but the toys in our sandbox are literal weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, that terrifying tension between our tools and our temperaments, that is the absolute core of what we are exploring today.
Right, because we are looking at a document designed specifically to address this exact gap. It's called the Peaceful World Manifesto, version 1.0.
And it frames this existential crisis beautifully. They call it the Promethean gap.
The Promethean gap. Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly does that mean in the context of the manifesto?
Well, the Promethean gap is essentially the defining paradox of the modern era. The authors diagnose our current evolutionary mismatch with three really evocative phrases.
Yeah, I loved these when I read them.
Right. They argue that humanity is currently operating with Paleolithic emotions. We rely on medieval institutions, and all of this is happening while we wield godlike technology.
Godlike technology with Paleolithic emotions. It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And the core argument they are making is that if we don't forcefully close this gap, if we do not upgrade those medieval institutions to handle our godlike tech doll, our self-destruction isn't just a possibility, it is a statistical probability.
Which is why the formatting of this document is so striking to me. Right on the cover. It doesn't call itself a philosophical treatise or some political essay.
No, not at all. It refers to itself as an open-source operating system.
Right, an operating system for a peaceful civilization. But here is the catch for you listening today. We are not looking at the entire operating system.
Because it's huge.
Yeah, it's massive. The manifesto covers everything from planetary defense against asteroids to global economics. But underneath all of that, at the very root of the code, is a specific section.
The Constitution of Survival.
Yes, the Constitution of Survival. The authors also call it the ethical minimum. And it consists of just 5 non-negotiable principles. We are exclusively focusing on those 5 points today.
Framing it as an operating system is a really deliberate choice, too. It moves the whole conversation away from, utopian daydreaming.
Makes it more concrete.
Exactly. Peace, in this framework, is not a fleeting feeling. It's not just the temporary absence of gunfire while nations reload. It is a structural reality.
It's infrastructure. It has to be coded, installed, rigorously maintained, and legally enforced.
Right. And the reason they call these 5 points the ethical minimum is because they genuinely believe this is the absolute baseline required to shift the global Overton window.
The window of normalcy. Right now, our collective window of what is normal includes war. We just accept it as a fact of life.
We do. And the manifesto invokes the Thomas theorem from sociology here. It basically says that if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequence.
Oh, that makes total sense. Because our medieval institutions define war as an inevitable reality of human nature, it literally becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Precisely. We build trillion-dollar industries around it. We structure all our international relations around the threat of it.
So the goal of this ethical minimum is to shift that Overton window so violently that the collective definition of reality changes.
Yeah, the authors want to engineer a civilization where murder and war become as structurally and socially unthinkable as human sacrifice or chattel slavery.
Because those practices were also once considered eternal, unavoidable laws of human nature. But our ethical norms shifted and our institutions followed.
Exactly. It's happened before, and they argue it has to happen again.
But getting there requires confronting how deeply embedded violence is in our current system. If we look at the very first principle of this ethical minimum, it tackles this head-on.
Point 1. The ban on normalization.
Right, the ban on normalization. The argument here is that taking a human life can never, under any circumstances, be recognized as an acceptable political tool or a standard way of solving a problem.
We really have to pause and examine that phrase, political tool, because historically that is exactly what war has been.
Yeah, it is the ultimate political lever.
Right. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz famously codified this. He said that war is simply the continuation of politics by other means.
Which has been the accepted global software for centuries. If diplomacy gets too frustrating or a head of state wants to secure a border, they just reach into the toolbox and pull out the military.
It is entirely normalized. But this first principle explicitly outlaws that Clausewitzian mindset. You cannot use human lives as a geopolitical bargaining chip.
But, this is where I immediately hit a wall of skepticism when I was reading the document.
Oh, I'm sure you weren't the only one.
Right, because it is very easy to sit in a comfortable room and declare that violence is never an acceptable tool. But the real world is incredibly messy and often deeply malicious.
It certainly is.
So, what happens when a neighboring regime starts actively committing genocide? Or what happens when an authoritarian state rolls tanks across your border? Does this ethical minimum demand that a society just sit on its hands and practice absolute pacifism while they are annihilated?
That is the natural, necessary pushback, and the authors actually anticipate it.
Okay, so it's not a suicide pact.
No, not at all. They do not advocate for naive pacifism. The crucial nuance lies in the second half of this first principle.
Which says what exactly?
It states that even if defending life absolutely requires the use of physical force, that force must remain a tragic exception. It can never be the rule.
A tragic exception. So it doesn't strip a society of the right to protect itself or stop a greater evil.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is what it meticulously strips away. It strips away the glory.
Oh, wow. Stripping away the glory. That is a massive psychological pivot.
It fundamentally rewrites the cultural narrative around self-defense. Think about how modern societies treat the necessary use of military force today.
We don't treat it as a tragedy at all. We treat it as a triumph.
We do. We hold massive parades, we build triumphal arches, we pin medals on chests, write heroic anthems, and produce blockbuster movies glorifying the tactical genius of the operation.
We normalize the violence through cultural glorification. I never really thought about it like that.
Right. The manifesto is arguing that if you are genuinely forced into a situation where you have to use violence to stop an atrocity, you haven't won a glorious victory. You have experienced a catastrophic systemic failure.
That makes me think of an emergency at a nuclear power plant.
Oh, how so?
Like, imagine the cooling systems fail and the engineers realize the core is melting down. They might have to make the extreme decision to intentionally flood the reactor with seawater to prevent a massive explosion.
Okay, yeah. A last resort.
Right. And flooding the reactor ruins a multi-billion-dollar facility, but it saves the surrounding city. Now, the day after they do that, the engineers don't throw a parade.
Definitely not.
They don't write songs celebrating the genius of flooding the reactor. They treat it as a profound, terrifying tragedy.
That is a perfect analogy.
The immediate response is an urgent investigation. Like, how did our safety protocols fail so spectacularly that we were forced to resort to this extreme measure? The focus is entirely on cleaning up the toxic fallout and ensuring it never happens again.
Yes, that nuclear analogy is the exact mindset the ethical minimum demands for the use of force. Violence, even when entirely unavoidable and justified, leaves behind moral and physical toxicity.
It requires intense healing, not a heroic geopolitical strategy.
Right. If this ban on normalization were actually codified into international law, the entire vocabulary of statecraft would have to change overnight.
A politician could no longer stand at a podium and justify a preemptive strike as a necessary evil or the routine price of security.
They could not sell a conflict as a patriotic adventure. They would have to announce it with the somber gravity of a trauma surgeon announcing they have to amputate a limb to save the patient. It is a failure of preventive medicine.
And if we carry that medical analogy forward, I think it perfectly illustrates the friction of transitioning from the first point to the second point.
It really does. Because if violence is no longer a standard tool in your toolbox, you need new tools.
Exactly. If you are legally and culturally banned from reaching for violence to solve your problems, you cannot just ban amputation without inventing a whole lot of other medical treatments.
Which brings us to the operational core of the manifesto, point 2.
The priority of nonviolence. This principle dictates that in any conflict whatsoever, there is a binding obligation to exhaust all nonviolent means of de-escalation before force can even be considered.
And the operative load-bearing word in that principle is exhaust.
Exhaust.
Yes, this is where the text transitions from a moral philosophy into systems engineering. Exhausting nonviolent means is not just a passive suggestion to sit down and talk things out.
It's not just an ambassador having one tense meeting and then declaring, well, diplomacy failed, send in the bombers.
Exactly. It is a demanding, active, rigorous protocol.
Think about what it actually takes for a doctor to definitively exhaust alternatives before amputating a gangrenous leg. It is a grueling process.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. They don't just glance at the infection and fire up the bone saw.
No, they are ethically bound to a massive flowchart of interventions. First, they try broad-spectrum antibiotics. If those don't work, they run cultures and pivot to targeted IV antibiotics.
They might try hyperbaric oxygen therapy to force oxygen into the wound.
Right, they do minor, precise debridement surgeries to scrape away dead tissue to save the healthy tissue underneath. They consult specialists, they try experimental drugs to improve blood flow.
They rigorously step through every single less invasive option available to modern science.
And only when every single one of those interventions has definitively failed and the infection is actively threatening to stop the patient's heart do they resort to the saw. The manifesto is arguing that society must treat the use of lethal force with that exact same level of agonizing procedural exhaustion.
And just like in the medical field, to exhaust those options, you must first invent them. You have to fund them and build the infrastructure to deliver them.
Because you cannot exhaust diplomatic options if you haven't built robust, permanent diplomatic channels in the first place.
Right. You cannot utilize de-escalation tactics if your leaders and law enforcement haven't been exhaustively trained in conflictology.
The preamble actually talks about this, right? Utilizing advanced AI and big data to monitor conflicts.
Yes. Using the best practices of sociological research to manage conflicts before they reach the boiling point. This second principle essentially mandates the creation of a massive, well-funded infrastructure of peace.
But, I mean, let's be realistic about human nature for a second here. Think about the conflicts you see in the world right now.
Oh, they escalate instantly.
Yeah, think about international border disputes, or even domestic politics or corporate lawsuits. How often do institutions actually jump straight to the nuclear option?
Almost always.
Almost always.
Yeah.
We go straight for the lawsuit, straight for the economic sanction, straight for the military strike. And why? Because building and maintaining that nonviolent infrastructure is exhausting.
It is slow. It is incredibly expensive.
It requires immense patience and compromise. Going straight for the bone saw is, frankly, highly efficient if you don't care about the leg.
You've hit on the exact reason why our medieval institutions default to violence. It is economically and politically efficient for the people in power.
Right.
So the question becomes, why would any society willingly commit to such an exhausting, rigorous, frustrating process of nonviolent de-escalation? What could possibly justify that level of effort and systemic friction?
That is the million-dollar question.
Well, the only reason a trauma team fights for 48 hours straight to save a limb is because they believe the human life attached to that limb possesses a value that transcends the cost of their labor.
Ah, I see.
The exhaustion protocol only makes sense if there is an underlying non-negotiable value system driving it.
Which is exactly why the third principle exists. It anchors the entire document. The third point of the ethical minimum is the dignity of life.
The unconditional dignity of life.
Right. The text states that we must respect the intrinsic value of the human person. Now, when I first read that sentence, I have to admit, I rolled my eyes a little bit.
Really? Why is that?
Because it sounds like a platitude.
Okay.
It sounds like something you read on a generic corporate mission statement or a political bumper sticker.
I get what you mean. It sounds overly broad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every dictator, every warlord, and every corrupt CEO on the planet will look into a camera and claim they respect human dignity. So, what does this all mean? How does the manifesto take this universal cliché and turn it into a legal constraint with actual teeth?
It gives it teeth by anchoring it in a very specific philosophical concept and then backing that concept up with evolutionary biology.
Okay, let's start with the philosophy part.
Philosophically, the text explicitly references Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. The core rule here is that a human being must always be treated as an end in themselves, and never merely as a means to an end.
An end, not a means. That is the dividing line between a platitude and a binding law. Let's break down that difference because it is incredibly profound when you apply it to the real world. Treating someone as a means is essentially reducing a human being to the status of a tool, right? Like a stepping stone to achieve a separate goal.
Yes, and the history of human conflict is essentially the history of treating people as means.
Like when a general drafts 10,000 young men and sends them to charge a fortified trench just to secure a coal-rich valley, he is treating those men as a means to an economic end.
Exactly. Or when a military strategist calculates an acceptable number of civilian casualties, so-called collateral damage, in order to eliminate a high-value target with a drone strike.
They are engaging in spreadsheet morality.
Right. They're doing a mathematical equation where the lives of innocent people are the currency spent to purchase a geopolitical victory.
So the manifesto is saying that the moment you do that math, you have violated the constitution of survival.
Absolutely. If human dignity is unconditional, you cannot weigh it against the price of oil or the security of a border or the outcome of an election.
You cannot say sacrificing these 50 people is worth it because it will ensure the economic stability of 50 million people.
Hmm.
Utilitarianism, the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number at the expense of the few, is completely outlawed by this principle.
It is entirely outlawed. A person cannot be a fraction in your geopolitical equation. But what makes this section of the manifesto truly fascinating is that it doesn't just rely on 18th century philosophy to make this argument.
Right, you mentioned biology earlier.
Yes, it roots this concept of dignity in the hard science of our biology. The authors discuss what they call the anthropological norm.
The anthropological norm, what is that exactly?
They cite evolutionary biology and the function of mirror neurons in the human brain.
Mirror neurons.
Yes, they are a network of brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that same action. They are the physiological, biological basis for empathy.
Oh, wow. So if I watch someone accidentally slice their finger with a kitchen knife, my brain literally simulates a fraction of that pain.
Exactly. Your nervous system reacts to their injury.
And the manifesto takes that biological fact and builds a massive ethical argument on top of it.
They do. They argue that because of these mirror neurons and because of an innate human trait called biophilia, an instinctual love for living systems, a deep physiological aversion to violence is actually coded into our DNA.
That is such a radical reframing of the human story. I mean, we are constantly taught, usually by those medieval institutions we talked about, that humans are inherently savage.
Right, the whole apex predator narrative.
Exactly. We are taught that human history is just a long, bloody story, and that modern civilization is just a very thin, fragile veneer of manners painted over a core of violent Paleolithic rage.
But the manifesto is looking at the neuroscience and arguing the exact opposite. Empathy is not the fragile veneer. Empathy is the biological default setting. Violence is the aberration.
The text boldly claims that peace and compassion are our anthropological norm. And we have historical and psychological evidence to back this up.
We do. Look at the phenomenon of PTSD, or more specifically, moral injury among combat veterans.
Moral injury. I've heard that term gaining traction recently.
Modern psychology is realizing that much of the trauma soldiers bring back from war isn't just the fear of being killed. It is the profound psychological shattering that occurs when they are forced to kill someone else.
Because their nervous system, their mirror neurons, their entire biological makeup is screaming that taking a life is wrong, but the state has ordered them to do it.
Exactly. The trauma is the direct result of breaking their own biological norm. The manifesto points out that humans actually have to be systematically conditioned to kill.
We have to undergo intense basic training to break down our natural hesitation.
Right. We have to be fed constant dehumanizing propaganda to view the enemy not as humans with mirror neurons, but as vermin or savages or threats. We have to be artificially taught to treat others as a means to an end.
So this third principle, the unconditional dignity of life, isn't just asking us to be nice to each other.
No, it is demanding that our institutions stop systematically breaching our biological default. It is demanding that the software of our society align with the hardware of our neurology, rather than exploiting our capacity for fear.
And this creates a massive logical cascade. Because if a human being is an end in themselves, possessing an unconditional dignity,
Right.
and if their biological default setting is a profound aversion to violence,
Yes.
then it logically follows that a state, a government, or any institution absolutely cannot force a human being to violate their own biological and moral core. A system cannot force a person to break their own mind.
Which leads us directly to the fourth point of the ethical minimum.
And I genuinely believe this is the most provocative, radical, and structurally disruptive idea in the entire document. Point 4,
Right.
the right to refuse.
This is undoubtedly the fulcrum upon which the entire manifesto balances. It is the mechanism that transfers power from the state back to the individual.
The principle reads that there's an inalienable human right to refuse to kill. It legally codifies the status of a conscientious objector, not as a rare loophole for certain religious groups, but as a universal human right.
And the language the authors use here is incredibly intense.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They state that coercing someone into violence against their conscience is absolutely unacceptable, and they equate it with a form of moral torture.
Moral torture.
That isn't just colorful rhetoric. It is a very precise legal and psychological accusation.
To understand the sheer gravity of that phrase, we really have to look at the historical precedent the text explicitly invokes in the very next sentence. It anchors this right to refuse directly to Nuremberg Principle the Fourth.
Let's dive into the history of that because it is crucial context. After the horrors of World War II, the international community convened the Nuremberg trials to prosecute the architects of the Holocaust and the Nazi war machine. And one of the most common recurring defenses used by the officers and soldiers on trial was the concept of superior orders. Befehl is Befehl. An order is an order.
They argued they had no choice.
Exactly. The defendants argued that they were legally bound to obey the state. The state made the laws, the military hierarchy issued the commands, and the individual soldier had no legal choice but to comply.
They argued that the moral and legal responsibility for the atrocities lay solely with the government, not with the individual who pulled the trigger or pulled the lever, because they were simply cogs in a machine.
And the international community realized that if they accepted that defense, there could be no justice and no way to prevent future atrocities.
So they established Nuremberg Principle this Fourth. This principle established a revolutionary, unprecedented legal reality.
What exactly did it state?
It stated that the fact that a person acted pursuant to an order of his government or of a superior does not relieve him from moral responsibility under international law, provided a moral choice was in fact possible to him.
Oh, wow. It effectively declared that your personal moral compass, your individual conscience, supersedes the dictates of your government, your commanding officer, and your national law.
Precisely. And the manifesto is taking Nuremberg Principle of the Feet out of the context of a post-war tribunal and applying it as a proactive foundational law for all of human society.
It is making a radical claim about the absolute sovereignty of the individual mind.
The authors are arguing that if you force a peaceful person, someone whose biological and ethical default is averse to killing, to become an instrument of death under threat of imprisonment or execution, you are committing a profound violation of their personhood.
You're forcing them to shatter their own anthropological norm.
Yes. The psychological devastation of that coercion, the cognitive dissonance of being forced to physically act against your own deeply held moral compass, is equated to physical torture. It is the deliberate mangling of a human soul.
Think about the massive, world-altering structural implications of this. What happens if a global operating system legally guarantees this right to refuse for every single citizen on Earth?
It changes everything.
What does the geopolitical landscape look like when a government can no longer legally compel its citizens to take up arms? Historically, the ultimate defining power of the nation-state is its monopoly on violence.
And a massive part of that monopoly is the power of conscription.
The draft. The power of a government to say, you were born within these imaginary lines on a map, therefore you are my citizen, and therefore I have the legal authority to compel you to march into a meat grinder to fight my enemies.
This fourth principle strips the state of that power entirely. It says the state does not own your conscience. It does not own your mirror neurons.
So if a government decides it wants to fight a war, it cannot legally draft a single person to do it. It can only rely on individuals who voluntarily, without any coercion, choose to participate.
It completely defangs the military-industrial complex's ability to endlessly feed unwilling bodies into a conflict. It creates an intentional, structural bottleneck for warfare.
Let's run a hypothetical scenario to see how this plays out. Imagine two nations with rising tensions.
Okay. Nation A and Nation B.
Right. And the diplomatic infrastructure we talked about in Principle 2 has failed. The leaders of Nation A decide they want to initiate a military conflict to secure a resource in Nation B.
Under our current medieval institutions, the leader of Nation A signs a piece of paper, activates the military, initiates a draft, and millions of young people are legally forced to march to the border under threat of treason.
But under the ethical minimum, when that leader signs the paper, the citizens have the codified, universally recognized right to say no.
I recognize the unconditional dignity of the people across the border. My biological norm rejects this violence. You cannot morally torture me into pulling the trigger.
And if a significant portion of the population exercises that right, the government simply runs out of hands to hold the weapons. The war machine grinds to a halt because it has no fuel.
It returns the ultimate, final veto power over violence back to the individual citizen.
But again, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Because that sounds beautiful in a vacuum.
There's always a catch, right?
Well, yeah. What if Nation A adopts the ethical minimum and Nation B is still operating on medieval institutions? If Nation B invades and the citizens of Nation A exercise their right to refuse to fight, Nation A simply gets conquered, subjugated, and destroyed by a less ethical neighbor.
It's a valid concern.
Doesn't this principle basically guarantee that the most ruthless, violent societies will inherit the earth, while the peaceful societies voluntarily disarm themselves?
That is the classic prisoner's dilemma of disarmament. But the manifesto is not advocating for unilateral disarmament by a single nation. Remember the premise. This is a version 1.0 operating system for a global civilization.
So it only works if everyone is running the same software.
The ethical minimum is designed to be a universally adopted baseline. Furthermore, the right to refuse to kill does not equate to the right to do nothing.
Oh, that's an important distinction.
A society can refuse to use lethal force while simultaneously engaging in massive, coordinated, nonviolent resistance. They can use economic sabotage, cyber defense, and diplomatic isolation against an invader.
The text forces societies to innovate their defense mechanisms beyond the Paleolithic concept of throwing a rock at the other guy's head.
Exactly. So the first 4 points establish an incredibly rigid, robust set of rules.
Let's recap them real quick. We have the ban on normalization, which strips away the glory of violence. We have the priority of nonviolence, the exhausting infrastructure of de-escalation. We have the dignity of life, the biological and philosophical constraint against treating people as means. And we have the right to refuse, the individual's absolute veto against state coercion.
These are clear, bright-line directives.
But anyone who studies history or geopolitics knows that reality is rarely characterized by clear, bright lines. Reality is messy.
It is shrouded in chaos, misinformation, conflicting intelligence, and panic.
Right. So what happens when the right path isn't obvious? What happens when a leader or an institution faces an unprecedented crisis? The clock is ticking, and the data is incomplete. If you are bound by these strict ethical constraints, how do you make a decision in the dark?
That exact problem is what the 5th and final point of the Constitution of Survival is designed to solve.
Point 5. The presumption of life.
This final principle is the ultimate ethical tiebreaker. It is the emergency fail-safe mechanism designed to govern the fog of war.
And the principle states very simply, in situations of uncertainty, we must always choose the decision that preserves life and minimizes harm.
To really grasp how this operates mechanically, let's look at a parallel concept we already use in our legal systems, the presumption of innocence, innocent until proven guilty.
Why does that concept exist? Because human justice systems are flawed. Trials are confusing. Evidence can be circumstantial. Witnesses lie or misremember.
When a jury goes into a deliberation room, they are often navigating a dense fog of uncertainty.
The philosophical bedrock of our justice system says that in the face of that uncertainty, the default verdict must always be the one that minimizes the harm of wrongful destruction. We have collectively decided that it is better for 10 guilty people to go free than for the state to unjustly lock one innocent person in a cage. We default to freedom.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the manifesto takes that exact same structural logic and applies it to global crisis management.
So when leaders are navigating the terrifying fog of a geopolitical meltdown, the default verdict must always be whatever preserves human life.
It is a brilliant systemic constraint because it entirely removes the guesswork from crisis management. Let's apply this to a real-world scenario. Let's look back at the lead-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
Oh, that's a perfect example of uncertainty.
The global intelligence community was navigating a massive fog of uncertainty regarding weapons of mass destruction. There were conflicting reports, vague satellite images, and unverified defectors.
And under the medieval institutions of the time, the leaders looked at that uncertainty and made a calculated gamble. They decided the risk of waiting was too high.
They initiated a preemptive war based on a hypothesis. They gambled hundreds of thousands of human lives on uncertain data.
If the ethical minimum had been the binding operating system of international law at that time, that preemptive strike would have been structurally impossible.
The presumption of life dictates that you do not gamble with lives based on projections, probabilities, or suspicions.
If Action A is a preemptive strike that has a perceived chance of eliminating a theoretical threat but guarantees mass casualties, and Action B is continued inspections and containment, which achieves less definitive security but preserves life.
The leader is legally and ethically bound to choose Action B.
It forces an intense deceleration that is so contrary to modern military doctrine, which constantly preaches speed, agility, and overwhelming initial force.
The military-industrial complex teaches that in a crisis, hesitation gets you killed. You have to strike first.
But the presumption of life acts as an emergency brake on that Paleolithic panic. In moments of extreme tension, when every medieval instinct is screaming for a swift, aggressive, violent response to clear away the uncertainty, this principle forces leaders to stop.
It says, if you do not know the exact outcome of your actions, you must default to the path of least harm. You wait. You verify. You exhaust even more nonviolent options. You preserve life above all other strategic considerations.
We can actually look at a historical example where a single individual intuitively applied this exact principle and literally saved the world.
Are you thinking of Stanislav Petrov?
Yes. In 1983, a Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov was on duty at a nuclear early warning bunker. Suddenly, the computers triggered massive alarms, indicating that the United States had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles at the Soviet Union.
That is the ultimate fog of war.
According to his strict military protocols as medieval institutions, his duty was to immediately report the incoming strike to Soviet leadership, which almost certainly would have triggered a massive retaliatory nuclear holocaust.
But Petrov was facing the unknown. He looked at the data and felt uncertainty. Why only 5 missiles? A first strike would logically be an overwhelming barrage.
Right. He was faced with a choice. Trust the system and risk annihilating billions of lives based on a potential computer glitch or break protocol, assume it was a false alarm, and do nothing.
He chose the presumption of life.
He did. He reported it as a system malfunction. And he was right. The alarms were triggered by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds.
Petrov personally enacted the 5th principle of the ethical minimum. He defaulted to life in the face of absolute uncertainty.
And the manifesto is arguing that we cannot rely on the rare, miraculous luck of having a Stanislav Petrov sitting in the right chair at the right time. We have to hard-code his ethical intuition into the very fabric of our global governance.
Exactly. When you step back and look at these 5 principles together, you realize this isn't just a list of unrelated good ideas.
This is a tightly integrated, interlocking system of gears. Every principle reinforces the others.
It starts at the cultural level with the ban on normalization. We must agree that violence is a tragic failure, not a tool.
Because it's a failure, we are forced to build the operational mechanism of the priority of nonviolence, the exhausting infrastructure of de-escalation.
We only fund and endure that exhaustion because we recognize the biological and philosophical dignity of life, treating humans as ends, not means.
Because we have that innate dignity, we are granted the absolute right to refuse, protecting the individual from the moral torture of state coercion.
And finally, when all systems are stressed and the fog of uncertainty rolls in, we rely on the presumption of life, the emergency brake that defaults to preservation.
And as we stated at the very beginning of this deep dive, the authors of the manifesto do not view these 5 points as a utopian wish list for a distant, enlightened future.
No, they present them as the urgent, non-negotiable hard laws of human survival. We are standing on the edge of the Promethean gap. We are monkeys playing with thermonuclear fire and artificial intelligence.
If we continue to wield our godlike technologies while allowing our Paleolithic emotions and medieval institutions to bypass these 5 minimum ethical locks, the manifesto makes it grimly clear: we will not survive our own adolescence as a species.
Closing this gap isn't about achieving perfection. It is about achieving the minimum viable morality required to keep the human experiment going.
We have to upgrade our morality to match our technology. The blueprint is sitting right in front of us, but installing the update is going to require dismantling a lot of very profitable, very entrenched systems.
It will be the challenge of our era.
As we wrap up our exploration of the ethical minimum, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own as you go about your day.
Oh, this is a good one.
I want you to imagine that you wake up tomorrow morning and through some unprecedented miracle of global consensus, these 5 principles were suddenly irreversibly codified as the supreme legally binding law of the land in your country.
The ban on normalization, priority of nonviolence, dignity of life, right to refuse, and presumption of life.
They are now the operating system governing every politician, every general, every corporate boardroom, and every local police department. Based on what you observe in your society today, the way your government handles protests, the way your economy values labor, the rhetoric you see on the evening news, the foreign policies your taxes fund, what is the very first system, institution, or daily practice that would immediately break or become entirely illegal under this new constitution of survival?
It's a heavy question.
And once that deeply entrenched system shatters,
Yeah.
what exactly are we going to build to replace it? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this source material.
It's been a profoundly important exploration. Thank you.